Last week we encountered John the Baptizer again out on the wilderness, out in the edges. And people came and they listened. And John said, there's someone coming and someone that you've been waiting for. And so you need to get yourselves ready. You need to stop. Literally, that Greek word metanoia, stop. Stop right where you are and make a turn. And then John says, oh, and by the way, in preparation, you need to get washed up. So come on and be baptized. John, that strange character who seems so powerful. And the religious establishment shows up and John calls them what? A brood of vipers. You bunch of sorry snakes. Fire comes out of John's bones. He's brave, he's bold, he's a prophet. That's what prophets do. Today, however, we encounter John later. And John now is in a prison cell. Prison cells are hard places to keep the fire stoked and the passion alive. Why was John in a prison cell? He did the fatal mistake that any preacher knows not to do. He mixed politics and religion. Now, there's a discourse here. I got to throw this in. I throw this in as often as I possibly can for people who buy that, whatever it is. That power, and that's what politics is, make no mistakes. It is by definition how the polis uses power. People are making power that either have constructive or destructive consequences in people's lives. And we have been called to be about the faithfulness of relationship, both with our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. And so then we say, oh, by the way, we, as people of faith, we believe faith has to do with everything, but not how power gets used. So we're going to sit on the sidelines and be quiet. How silly is that? How unbiblical is that? Antipas, Caesar's puppet in the region. He had taken his niece who had married his brother, and he took her away from his brother and married her. And John felt that was somehow inappropriate. And so John lifts his voice and cries out. And in his passion, of course, it would eventually cost him his head. The hokey pokey lectionary group didn't quite understand the remark I made, that I'm always leery reading John's stories living with two belly dancers. Because if you've read the story, you know that John lost his head over a good dance. So here he is in the jail. And now it sets in. The wondering, the questioning. You see, when you're locked away, and this is what all Caesars know, when you've locked away the prophets and you've silenced the prophets, then life gets easier. Nelson Mandela, years in prison, locked away, and even as he was locked away, truth wouldn't die. And even among those who were guarding him, respect grew through the years. Martin Luther King, stuck in a crummy jail in Birmingham, Alabama, by people who wanted to claim their Southern heritage. And as a son of the South, I wonder why in God's name would we want to claim a heritage where people get owned, and then during Jim Crow days, they got lynched. Something that we supposedly want to keep. Martin Luther King couldn't understand why the white pastors and white church folk he passed by every day would simply look at the issue and turn the other way. And so, though he was silenced from speaking in jail, he wrote letters from the Birmingham jail that eventually found their way to listening ears. Powerful pieces. But Caesars always think that they can quiet the prophets. And here John is now quieted. And so it sets in, the wondering. And so he calls some of his disciples and he sends them to Jesus asking this question: are you the one? Or should we look for another? John, who was so certain Jesus was the one, cousin Jesus, so sure at baptism, saw the power of God gracing this one, blessing this one, and now from the prison cell he has questions. It's not a cynical question, because note there's a word of hope there. Are you the one? There's the skeptical question. Or should we look for another? Which means that John hasn't given up the assurance that God will do what God has said, and that sooner or later the Messiah would come. I think back in my journey how many times I have found myself locked in a prison and faith wavering, and I no longer am certain as I thought I would be. I remember early in life how important it was to be liked. My grandfather, who planted all those little Baptist churches in western North Carolina, he was mostly liked. Well, I can remember 2 or 3 people, but that's a different story. I wanted to be liked. It's the imprisonment we experience when our whole existence is about being liked. And so we find ourselves working ourselves into oblivion, because if we work hard enough and if we impress people, surely people will like us. That's what it takes to be liked. Work yourself to death. Do whatever it takes. How many people have found themselves in that prison? And the harder you work, the less assured you are, and the harder it gets to juggle things in life. And we become weary, and the faith questions get harder. How many of you have found yourselves locked away in whatever prison that you have bought into? There are many kinds. Sadly, across the country, there are people who have locked themselves into the prison, not always by their choice, but by people longing to make more and more money, a prison of opioid making. And it gets worse and worse until they find themselves seeing no end. And oftentimes, if they don't die of overdose or get some help, they find themselves taking their own lives because it seemed so hopeless. People who once had lives and values, who thought they knew where they were going, but they were locked in a different kind of prison, and they lost their way and were no longer sure where the way was or who the one might be. I preached a sermon on fear and all the fears that grip us. Years ago, I preached this, and somebody who wasn't a member of the church but was actually married to somebody on the search committee came to me earnestly asking the question, what is it that you are so afraid of? He sensed that I was fearful. And I said to him, why don't you tell me what you're afraid of? And he said, no, you're not getting by with that. So I said, You take a week to ponder your fear, and next Sunday morning I'll preach a sermon on mine. And my fear throughout a good part of my life, connected up to the likableness thing, is I feared most of all in all things in life, not waking up in front of a class naked, like some people seem to have a fear of, but my fear was getting fired. That's the most awful, fearful thing I can imagine, because it meant that I really wasn't likable, and besides, I'd be broke at the same time of not being liked. It stayed with me. It cramped my ministry. It put binds on what I could say. It was a prison, you see. But when you're in prison, you can never truly move forward to that place that you need to arrive at, to find your voice and your place in the world and your ministry and the truth that needs to be told for yourself and for others who might be listening. I've lived my whole life pastoring people, and sooner or later, if intimacy develops, I find out what their prison might be. John was in a literal prison, and in that prison, he developed that little nagging sense of, well, are you the one? Now, I need to say this about that. It's not bad to ask the doubt questions. In fact, you can never get clarity unless you live with the doubt questions. We're always afraid, well, I can't doubt my faith. I can't. And I've sat with people in the hospital, in intensive care units, or in a hospice situation, and the thing that they get caught up on is the fear, because they find themselves doubting at a critical moment. And oftentimes I'll respond with an arm around them saying, how utterly human of you. And don't you think the one who made you human understands what being a human is about? The journey we walk, the places we go, the choices we make. John asked the question from prison. He had expectations. He expected something. And then here's the thing. This always irritates me about Jesus. Later, the early church would have people like Peter and Paul, and they were always glad to tell people the truth because they knew it all, the truth. But if you read the scripture, Jesus doesn't answer John. What does he say? He says, go back and tell John what you've seen and heard. And some of what he tells John to go back and report, by the way, you can find that prophets did in the stories from the Hebrew scriptures. Jesus doesn't come twisting our arms, beating us over the head. Jesus doesn't come, here it is on the silver platter. You want it rare or you want it well done? Jesus simply tells stories, heals the sick, loves the people, lives the life full of love until the empire eventually has its day with him. And then we're left to decide whether we will follow or not. Follow with our doubts or not. The Christmas question that we face, and it's only a few days away. Have you done your Christmas shopping? It's only a few days away. And the question we're left pondering is, this one that's coming, is this one the one? Or should we be looking for another? Whatever your answer may be, don't make it from a prison place. Don't let fear drive you in some direction one way or the other. It's not what Jesus would have taught nor wanted. Make this decision based on love, because perfect love casts out the fear and sets you free. Is the Christ child the one? Or should we wait for another? I can only answer for me in this place on this day. I have received truth by way of the Spirit through the gospel stories, and have chosen throughout my life to try to follow Jesus. It's not my job to answer that question for you. I'm just your pastor, pointing directions, trying to love you in the name of the one I believe was the one who came. So as you ask the Christmas question, that's on you. But let the Spirit free you up. Be freed even as you were being made whole by the living Christ. Wait a minute, I got 2 more pages in my pocket. The question is yours. Well,